Welcome to Conspiracy Q. Get ready for another top-secret investigation. This time we're diving into one of the biggest conspiracies ever, the 1969 moon landing. You guys send in tons of stuff about it, all these arguments from people who think it was all fake, a big hoax. So we're going to break it all down. We're going to look at the most interesting, most disturbing points, our mission, to get to the heart of this whole thing, cut through the noise and understand what these allegations are really about. You want the truth, right? Well, you've come to the right place.
We've got a whole bunch of recently uncovered or classified sources here, like a mountain of evidence. One of them lays out the indisputable proof, as it calls it, that the moon landing was a big fat lie, a Cold War stunt cooked up by the White House. It goes deep into the photos, the physics, the reasons why they might have done it, and of course the supposed cover-up. Then we have another source that goes even deeper, down the rabbit hole. It's all about the dark side of the cover-up. Dead astronauts, the connection to Stanley Kubrick, aliens, puppet masters, missing data, and even questions about pictures from those lunar orbiters we have up there now. Oh, and to top it all off, we have a source that tries to explain how such a massive lie could have stayed hidden for over 50 years. Ready to dive in?
Let's jump right into it. We've all seen those iconic photos from the moon landing, but some people say they're full of gaffes. One big one is the lack of stars in any of the pictures. The theory here is that it wasn't an exposure issue, like a technical problem with the cameras. They say it was a deliberate choice to avoid any inconsistencies with what astronomers know about the stars. A pretty bold claim, right? To think that NASA would risk such a massive hoax on something like the position of the stars.
Right. It's a head-scratcher for sure. I mean, we all look up at the night sky and see a dazzling tapestry of stars, so it does seem odd that none of them show up in those moon photos. The source, though, presents it as a deliberate act of omission. They're saying that NASA was afraid of messing up the star positions in the photos, accidentally placing them where they shouldn't be. And they say that astronomers would be able to spot that instantly. It makes you wonder if it was really that calculated or if maybe there's a simpler explanation.
Okay, then there's the whole wonky shadows thing. You look at those photos, then the shadows are going in all different directions. The conspiracy folks say this is clear evidence of studio lighting, like they were filming it all on a soundstage. NASA, of course, says it's just the uneven terrain of the moon messing with the shadows. But this source isn't buying it.
Yeah, this one's a classic, isn't it? The wonky shadows. It plays on our intuition about light and shadow. We see those diverging shadows, and it just feels wrong if we're thinking about the sun being the only light source. This source really hammers home the point that the shadows don't match up with a single light source, the sun. They're claiming those shadows are proof positive that we're looking at a set with multiple light sources. Now, it is true that the moon's surface is pretty bumpy, craters, hills, and all that, and that can definitely mess with how shadows look. It's not as simple as sunlight hitting a flat surface. But for the people who wrote this source, that explanation is not good enough. They think it's too much of a coincidence.
Then there's this claim about identical backgrounds in photos that were supposedly taken miles apart. The theory here is that they were just reusing the same backdrop, like a cheap movie set, or maybe even repeating digital images. It sounds pretty far-fetched, doesn't it?
It does sound like something out of a low-budget sci-fi flick. But this source is trying to make the case that the backgrounds in some of those moon photos are just too similar to be natural. They're arguing that the consistency, the way some features repeat, suggests a constructed environment, like a soundstage, where they just didn't have a lot of different backdrops to work with. Makes you wonder about the sheer scale of fakery they'd need to pull this off. If it's true, could they really have created a set that convincing but ultimately repetitive?
Another one that always gets people talking is the crosshair catastrophe. Those crosshairs that were supposed to be on the camera lens. Well, in some photos, they appear to be behind objects, like they were added in later. This source claims it's evidence of sloppy photo editing. It's one of those details that, if true, would be a pretty big blunder.
Oh yeah, the crosshairs. This is a detail that really jumps out at you when you see those photos. The idea here is that they were adding objects into the photos after they were taken, and they didn't do a very good job of it, so those objects ended up covering the crosshairs. The source is basically arguing that this is clear evidence of photographic manipulation. It makes you wonder about the technology they were using back then and what kind of post-processing was even possible. Was it as advanced as this source claims, or is there another explanation?
And then, of course, there's the waving flag in the vacuum of space. The source just throws out NASA's explanation about the telescopic pole and wrinkles in the flag. They're going with studio air conditioning or maybe a clumsy stagehand. Come on, it's an airless environment. How does a flag wave like that?
Yeah, the waving flag, it's the image that just won't go away for the conspiracy theorists. It's such a visually striking detail, that flag billowing in the breeze
Yeah.
on the moon where there's no breeze. The source throws out NASA's explanation entirely and opts for a more down-to-earth scenario. They say it must have been air conditioning on a set or maybe even a stagehand accidentally brushing against the flag. It's a simple, relatable explanation, and that's what makes it so appealing to some people, I think.
Now let's move on to the physics. The source brings up the Van Allen radiation belts, which are these zones of intense radiation surrounding Earth. They question how the astronauts could have possibly survived a trip through those belts with the technology and shielding they had back in the 1960s. It's a valid concern, isn't it? I mean, we all know how dangerous radiation is.
Absolutely. The Van Allen belts are a serious hazard for space travel. The source is pointing out that the radiation levels in those belts are incredibly high, potentially lethal. They're claiming that the technology back in the 60s, especially the shielding on those spacecraft, just wouldn't have been enough to protect the astronauts. NASA's response, as I recall, is that the Apollo missions were carefully planned to minimize exposure to the belts. They say they timed it so they passed through the less intense areas quickly. Plus, they had shielding, although how effective it was is up for debate, according to this source. It does make you think, though, about the risks they were taking.
And then there's the whole issue of the blast crater. Or rather, the lack of one. You'd think that when a lunar module landed on the moon with its powerful engine firing, it would leave a pretty big crater underneath. But there's nothing. The source claims this is because it was gently placed on a set, not really landing at all. It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah, when you see those rocket launches from Earth, there's a lot of fire and fury, right? It makes sense to think that a lunar landing would leave a mark. But this source is adamant. No blast crater, no real landing. They're arguing that the absence of a crater is clear evidence that the module was carefully placed on a pre-prepared surface, maybe even a sound stage. Now, NASA does offer an explanation. They talk about how rocket exhaust behaves differently in a vacuum and how the moon's gravity is weaker than Earth's. They say the lunar dust is also very compacted, so it wouldn't be easily blasted away. But for some people, like the author of the source, that explanation is just too complicated, too convenient. They prefer the simpler, more visual explanation. No crater, no landing.
And what about the extreme temperatures on the moon? This source questions how the astronauts and their equipment could have survived those swings between scorching heat and freezing cold. It's hard to imagine anything surviving those kinds of conditions.
It's a brutal environment up there, that's for sure. Scorching heat during the day, bone-chilling cold at night. This source is saying that the technology they had in the 60s for both the spacesuits and the lunar module itself just wouldn't have been enough to protect the astronauts from those extreme temperature swings. Now, NASA, of course, says they had sophisticated thermal protection systems built into everything, but this source is skeptical. They're asking, was it really possible back then? It raises some interesting questions about the limits of 1960s engineering.
Now, this source lays out a pretty strong case for why someone might want to fake the moon landing in the first place. They talk about Kennedy's famous promise to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, the pressure of the Cold War, the need to distract from the Vietnam War and all the unrest back home, and of course, the massive amounts of money being poured into the space program. It paints a pretty compelling picture, doesn't it?
It does. It's about painting a picture of desperation and opportunity. They're arguing that the pressure to win the space race to fulfill Kennedy's promise was immense. And they say the U.S. government was facing some serious challenges at home, the Vietnam War, social unrest, so a big win like a moon landing would be a huge distraction, a boost for national morale. They also point out the vast sums of money involved, suggesting that some people might have seen an opportunity to, shall we say, mismanage those funds if a real moon landing proved too difficult or too expensive. It's a cynical view, for sure, but it's not entirely implausible.
This is where things start to get really interesting. The source claims that the cover-up itself is evidence of a hoax. They point to all those missing things, the lost Apollo 11 tapes, the blueprints for the Saturn V rocket and the lunar module. They even bring up the deaths of astronauts like Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Thomas Barron. And of course, they can't resist mentioning Stanley Kubrick and all those supposed clues in The Shining. It's starting to sound like a real conspiracy thriller, isn't it?
It is. This source is taking things to a whole new level. They're not just questioning the moon landing. They're claiming that there was a deliberate and sustained effort to cover it up. The missing tapes, the blueprints, they're presented as evidence that something's being hidden. And then they bring in the deaths of those astronauts. Gus Grissom, especially, was known for being critical of the Apollo program. His death in the Apollo 1 fire is particularly suspicious to some people. And then there's Thomas Barron, who died in a strange accident right after raising concerns about safety. It all adds to this sense of mystery and intrigue.
The source goes into a lot of detail about those astronaut deaths, particularly Gus Grissom. He was pretty outspoken in his criticism of the Apollo program, and then boom, he dies in that fire. The source suggests he might have been deliberately silenced. It's definitely fuel for the conspiracy fire.
Yeah, Gus Grissom is a key figure in this whole conspiracy narrative. He wasn't shy about voicing his concerns about the safety of the Apollo command module. In fact, he even hung a lemon on it during a test as a symbol of his dissatisfaction. And then he dies in that tragic fire, along with Ed White and Roger Chaffee. It's easy to see how that could feed into suspicions of foul play. This source is suggesting that Grissom might have known too much, maybe even been a threat to the alleged cover-up.
And then there's Thomas Barron, who wrote that critical report about safety issues just before the Apollo 1 fire. Then he dies in a freak accident shortly after testifying before Congress. And to make things even more suspicious, his report supposedly vanished. It's like something straight out of a spy novel.
It really is. Thomas Barron becomes a central figure in this part of the conspiracy. He had access to a lot of inside information, and he wasn't afraid to speak out. His report, which was critical of safety procedures, supposedly disappeared after his death. And the manner of his death, a car crash on a train track right after testifying before Congress, is incredibly suspicious to some people. It feeds right into that narrative of silencing whistleblowers.
And we can't forget about Stanley Kubrick. The source dives deep into the whole Kubrick connection, laying out all those supposed clues in the Shining Danny's Apollo 11 sweater, Room 237, the tank cans, the Native American imagery. It's a pretty imaginative theory, you have to admit.
It is. It's almost like a game, finding hidden meanings in a film. The Kubrick connection is one of those theories that really captures the imagination. This source claims that Kubrick, who directed 2001, A Space Odyssey, was secretly recruited by the government to film the fake moon landing. They say he left all these clues in The Shining as a kind of confession. It's all very symbolic and open to interpretation, of course.
Then things get even wilder. The source brings up the possibility that the real secret wasn't just faking the moon landing, but hiding the discovery of aliens. They say the Apollo footage was staged to keep the public from panicking about extraterrestrial life. They even suggest the whole Van Allen belts thing might have been a lie to scare other countries away from the moon.
That's right. We go from a Cold War hoax to a cosmic cover-up. This source throws out the idea that the Apollo missions, or maybe even secret missions before them, found evidence of aliens on the moon. And they say the government decided to keep it all under wraps, staging the moon landing to create a believable story. The Van Allen belts, in this version of events, become a convenient excuse to keep other countries from poking around up there.
The source also brings up the possibility of some shadowy group pulling the strings behind the scenes, something bigger than just NASA or even the president.
Yeah.
They mention the deep state, the military-industrial complex, and even this supposed secret group called MJ-12, which is a favorite in UFO circles. It's like we've gone from a conspiracy theory to a full-blown conspiracy universe.
It's a classic expansion of the conspiracy narrative. It starts with questioning the moon landing, then it expands to encompass the government, then shadowy organizations, and finally aliens. This source is suggesting that the moon landing hoax was just one small part of a much bigger, more sinister plan. They're talking about a hidden power structure, maybe a secret cabal that's controlling everything from behind the scenes. It plays into that deep-seated distrust of authority, the feeling that we're not being told the whole truth.
The source even talks about data voids and technological black holes, suggesting that there's missing data that would prove the moon landing was fake. They say some of the technology used in the Apollo program seemed too advanced for the time, hinting that maybe they had help from, well, you know who.
Right. It's the idea that they couldn't have done it without some kind of secret advanced technology, possibly alien tech. They point to inconsistencies in the data, missing telemetry, things that just don't add up scientifically. They also question how they achieved such sophisticated technology back then. It's about sowing seeds of doubt, creating the impression that there are these unexplained mysteries that point to a larger cover-up.
And get this, they even question the photos we have now from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, that satellite that's been taking high-resolution images of the moon. They claim there are inconsistencies in those photos too, suggesting that the fakery is still ongoing. It's a pretty bold claim to think that they're still trying to cover it up all these years later.
It's like the cover-up never ends. This source is arguing that even the evidence we have today, with all our advanced technology, can't be trusted. They're claiming that the images from the LRO are either fake or have been manipulated to keep the lie alive. It's an attempt to maintain that sense of doubt, to cast suspicion on anything that might contradict the conspiracy theory.
The source offers some pretty dire explanations for why this alleged cover-up would continue for so long. They say the consequences of admitting the truth would be catastrophic. They talk about geopolitical chaos, economic collapse, and a total loss of faith in institutions. It's like they're saying the world would end if we knew the moon landing was fake.
It's about raising the stakes, making it seem like the fate of the world rests on this secret. The source is claiming that revealing the truth about the moon landing would unravel society as we know it. They talk about global panic, the collapse of governments, economic meltdown. It's a pretty bleak picture. They're essentially arguing that the lie is too big to fail.
They also talk about compartmentalization, the idea that only a very small group of people knew the truth, while everyone else involved in the Apollo program genuinely believed it was real. That's a classic spy tactic, isn't it? Need to know and all that.
Right. It's about controlling the flow of information. The source is saying that the vast majority of people who worked on the Apollo program were completely in the dark. They were led to believe that they were really sending men to the moon. Only a select few, the puppet masters, so to speak, knew the truth. It's a way of explaining how such a huge secret could be kept for so long. If only a handful of people know, the risk of leaks is much lower.
And of course, they couldn't resist throwing in some sinister methods for silencing anyone who knew too much. They talk about intimidation, smear campaigns, bribery, and yes, those mysterious accidents again. They're really playing up the danger here, the idea that people were killed to protect this secret.
It's a classic element of any good conspiracy theory, the idea that the conspirators will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. They're using all the familiar tropes here. Threats, blackmail, character assassination, and in the most extreme cases, those convenient accidents that just happen to eliminate anyone who's getting too close to the truth. It all adds to the sense of paranoia and intrigue.
The source also talks about the power of public belief and the ridicule that people face if they question the official narrative. They say it's a very effective way of shutting down any dissent. After all, nobody wants to be called a crazy conspiracy theorist.
Right. It's the idea that social pressure can be just as effective as any other form of control. They're arguing that the widespread acceptance of the moon landing as a historical fact creates a powerful force that discourages people from questioning it. They say that anyone who dares to speak out is immediately labeled a kook, a fringe lunatic, and that fear of ridicule is enough to keep most people silent, even if they have doubts. It's a classic example of how social norms can be used to enforce conformity.
And then they bring up the media. They suggest that powerful forces might be controlling what we see and hear, suppressing any serious investigation into the moon landing. It's like they're saying we can't even trust what we read in the newspapers or see on TV.
It's the media manipulation angle. They're alleging that the media is complicit in this cover-up, either willingly or through coercion. They're saying that journalists are being pressured to ignore any evidence that contradicts the official narrative. It feeds into that distrust of mainstream media, the idea that we're not getting the full story, that there's a hidden agenda.
One interesting point they make is that there's no single irrefutable piece of evidence that proves the moon landing was faked. They say that's why the official story persists, because NASA can always offer explanations for the individual anomalies. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. Debunk one piece of evidence and another one pops up.
That's a key challenge for conspiracy theorists, the lap of that one smoking gun. They're forced to rely on circumstantial evidence, on interpreting existing data in a way that supports their theory. And NASA, of course, has counter-arguments for all of their claims. They have explanations for the missing stars, the wonky shadows, the waving flag. It becomes a battle of interpretations, and it's very difficult to definitively prove or disprove anything in that kind of situation.
And finally, the source argues that the moon landing is such a powerful symbol of national pride that admitting it was fake would be incredibly damaging to the American psyche. It's like they're saying we're too emotionally invested in the moon landing to ever accept that it might have been a lie.
Exactly. It's about the emotional weight of the event, its place in the national mythology. They're arguing that the moon landing is so deeply ingrained in our cultural identity, our sense of who we are as a nation, that admitting it was fake would be a devastating blow. It would shatter our faith in our institutions and our history. It would be like admitting that a cherished childhood memory was a lie, and that's a very difficult thing to accept.
So there you have it, a top-secret investigation into the moon landing conspiracy theories based on all this recently uncovered or classified information you guys sent in. We've gone from photographic oddities to astronaut deaths, aliens, shadowy puppet masters, and even the psychological impact of a national lie. What stands out to you as the most fascinating or maybe the most unsettling part of all this?
What really strikes me is the enduring power of these theories, the way they continue to captivate people's imaginations even after all these years. It's amazing how they've evolved, too, incorporating new elements like the Kubrick connection and the alien angle. It really speaks to a deep-seated desire to question authority, to challenge established narratives. And I think it also highlights our fascination with the unknown, the possibility that there are secrets being kept from us.
It's important to remember that the vast majority of scientists and historians agree that the Apollo moon landings were real. There's a mountain of evidence to support that. But the fact that these theories persist, that people are still debating this after over 50 years, says something about our relationship with truth and authority. Do we trust what we're told? Or do we question everything?
It's a healthy debate to have. We should always be critical thinkers, questioning what we're told, examining the evidence. But there's a difference between healthy skepticism and rejecting reality altogether. I think these moon landing conspiracy theories serve as a great reminder of the complexities of belief and the importance of evaluating evidence carefully.
Here's something to think about as we wrap up. If there were a single, irrefutable piece of evidence that could prove or disprove the moon landing hoax once and for all, what would it be? What would it take to settle this debate for good? It's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this top secret investigation on Conspiracy Q. Don't forget to rate and follow Conspiracy Q to share the truth.